June 4, 1942. The Pacific is quiet. Hundreds of miles northwest of Midway Atoll, for Japanese aircraft carriers cut through the dark ocean. Their decks are crowded with aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes wait below. Thousands of sailors move through the ships as the first light begins to spread across the horizon. They believe they are approaching another decisive victory. Japan has spent 6 months expanding across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Singapore has fallen. The Philippines are under Japanese assault. Across the region, Allied forces are retreating. But somewhere beyond the horizon, the Americans are waiting. At Midway, U.S. Marines prepare their defenses. American aircraft search the empty ocean. And aboard American carriers, pilots are being sent into the sky with only fragments of information about where the Japanese fleet might be. Neither side can see the other. Yet within hours, for Japanese fleet carriers among the most powerful warships in the Pacific will be burning. The battle that follows will last 4 days. Its consequences will last for the rest of the war. And it will begin with a secret the Japanese fleet does not know the Americans have discovered. By the spring of 1942, the war in the Pacific had entered a dangerous new phase. 6 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack destroyed or damaged several battleships and killed more than 2,400 Americans. But the result Japan needed most did not happen. The American aircraft carriers were not in port that morning. Those carriers would soon become central to the war. Japan's leaders had entered the Pacific War believing that a rapid series of victories could create a defensive perimeter too large for the United States to break. The strategy depended on speed. Japan would seize territory rich in resources, destroy or weaken Allied forces, and establish positions across the western and central Pacific. At first, the plan appeared to be working. Japanese forces moved into the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and other territories with remarkable speed. Singapore fell in February 1942. The Philippines campaign continued. By March, Japanese forces had captured Java, giving Japan access to enormous supplies of oil and other strategic resources. The Japanese military had built an empire across a vast section of the Pacific and Southeast Asia in only a few months. But territorial expansion created a new problem. Japan now had to defend what it had conquered. The distances were enormous. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Every new island, harbor, airfield, and naval base required men, aircraft, ships, fuel, ammunition, and communications. And the United States had not been destroyed. Its industrial capacity remained intact. Its Pacific Fleet remained capable of fighting. Most importantly, American aircraft carriers had survived Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval planners understood that those carriers were a threat. They could strike Japanese positions without warning, move rapidly across the ocean, and attack from distances far beyond the range of traditional naval artillery. The first major indication of this danger came in April 1942. On April 18, American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet and struck targets in Japan. The Doolittle raid caused limited physical damage, but its psychological effect was much larger. For Japanese leaders, the raid demonstrated something alarming. The Japanese homeland was still vulnerable. The United States could bring aircraft close to Japan using aircraft carriers. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, had already argued that Japan needed to exploit its temporary advantage before American industrial power could be fully mobilized. The Doolittle raid strengthened the urgency surrounding net thinking. Yamamoto wanted to force the remaining American carrier forces into a decisive battle. His proposed target was Midway Atoll. Midway was a small, isolated American outpost in the Central Pacific, roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. It had an airfield and defensive facilities, but its importance went far beyond its size. From Midway, American aircraft could threaten Japanese movements toward Hawaii. If Japan captured the atoll, it could extend its defensive perimeter farther east and potentially create another position from which to pressure Hawaii. But there was another objective. The American carriers. Yamamoto's operation was designed to draw them into battle and destroy them. The plan was enormous. Japanese forces would not approach Midway as a single fleet. Instead, the operation involved multiple groups spread across a huge area of ocean. A diversion toward the Aleutian Islands in Alaska would take place at approximately the same time. Japanese submarines would operate along likely American approaches. The main carrier striking force would move toward Midway under Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo. Four fleet carriers formed the heart of that force: Akoji, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. These were experienced ships operated by a navy that had spent years developing carrier aviation. Their aircraft and crews had already participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. By June 1942, Japan possessed one of the most formidable carrier forces in the world. But the Americans were no longer the same opponent they had been in December. The U.S. Navy had begun adapting to the new reality of carrier warfare. At Coral Sea in May, American and Japanese carrier forces had fought a battle in which the opposing fleets largely remained beyond visual contact. Aircraft had done the fighting. The Japanese carrier Shoho was sunk. The American carrier Lexington was lost. Japan also suffered damage to Shokaku, while Zuikaku emerged from the battle with its aircraft group heavily depleted. The battle prevented a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby from proceeding according to plan. More importantly, Coral Sea demonstrated that carrier warfare had changed naval combat. A ship did not necessarily have to see its enemy to destroy it. Aircraft could cross hundreds of miles of ocean, find the opposing fleet, attack, and return. That meant reconnaissance had become as important as guns. Information could determine where the battle happened before the first bomb was released. And in the weeks before Midway, the Americans possessed information the Japanese did not know they had. The United States had been reading portions of Japanese naval communications. At Station HYPO in Hawaii, intelligence officers and cryptanalysts had been working against the Japanese naval code system known as JN-25. One of the key figures was Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockefort. His team had been studying Japanese messages and trying to determine the location and purpose of a major Japanese operation. The messages repeatedly referred to a target identified by a code designation: AF. American intelligence officers suspected that AF was Midway. But suspicion was not enough. The Americans needed confirmation. They devised a simple deception. Midway was instructed to send an uncoded message reporting a problem with its freshwater system. Soon afterward, Japanese communications referred to a shortage of fresh water at AF. The Americans now had strong evidence that AF was Midway. The significance was enormous. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, could prepare an ambush instead of reacting blindly after the Japanese attack began. 3 American carriers were available for the operation: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea, and repairs were expected to take much longer. But the ship was rushed back into service at Pearl Harbor. Within days, she was ready. The Americans knew approximately what was coming. The Japanese did not know that the Americans knew. That imbalance would shape everything that followed. Still, intelligence alone could not win the battle. The Pacific was too vast. Aircraft could miss their targets. Ships could be delayed. Weather could change. Scouts could fail to find the enemy. Pilots could become lost. And commanders on both sides would have to make decisions with incomplete information. By early June, the Japanese fleet was moving east toward Midway. The American carriers were already waiting. The two forces were approaching the same stretch of ocean from different directions. Neither fleet could yet see the other. But the battle had already begun in another form: the battle for information, position, timing, and surprise. The Japanese plan depended on surprise. But surprise was already slipping away. By the end of May 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz had enough intelligence to understand the broad shape of the Japanese operation. He did not possess a perfect picture. American intelligence could not reveal every ship's exact position or every decision Japanese commanders would make. But it revealed something far more important. The Japanese were coming toward Midway. Nimitz therefore positioned his forces northeast of the atoll, outside the immediate area of the expected Japanese attack. His carriers would remain hidden as long as possible and strike when the Japanese fleet was committed. The strategy was risky. If American scouts failed, the Japanese could reach Midway and attack the island before the carriers were found. If the American carriers were discovered first, Japan's experienced carrier force could potentially attack them before American aircraft could respond. Everything depended on timing. Midway itself had become a heavily defended outpost. The island was small, flat, and surrounded by the immense Pacific. Its importance came from its location. Airfields on the atoll allowed American aircraft to search a wide area of ocean and attack approaching ships. Marine aircraft were stationed there alongside Army Air Forces and Navy aircraft. Among them were fighters, bombers, patrol aircraft, and torpedo planes. They were not all modern. Some were already becoming obsolete. But their presence meant that the Japanese carrier force could not simply approach Midway without resistance. The Japanese knew the island would have to be neutralized. That was the first phase of Nagumo's mission. His carriers would launch a major strike against Midway. Then the Japanese would assess the results. If the American fleet appeared, the carrier force would attack it. If the American fleet did not appear, the Japanese would continue with the invasion plan. On paper, the operation was powerful. In reality, it contained a dangerous problem. The Japanese fleet was divided into separate forces operating hundreds of miles apart. Yamamoto's main body was behind Nagumo. A separate force was moving toward the Aleutians. A landing force was preparing to seize Midway. Submarines were positioned along expected American routes. This made coordination difficult. The enormous distances of the Pacific meant that commanders could not communicate instantly or observe the entire battlefield. Messages traveled by radio, and Japanese doctrine emphasized radio silence whenever possible. The result was a battle in which senior commanders often had incomplete information about what other forces were doing. Nagumo's carrier force was the most important component of the initial attack. His 4 carriers carried hundreds of aircraft, supported by cruisers, destroyers, and other vessels. The crews were experienced. Many had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor and the campaigns that followed. Their aircraft represented the leading edge of Japanese naval aviation. The Mitsubishi A6M0 provided fighter protection. The Nakajima B5N could carry torpedoes or bombs. The Aichi D3A dive bomber could attack ships with considerable accuracy. These aircraft gave Japanese carriers an enormous striking range. But aircraft carriers had a vulnerability that battleships did not. Their weapons were stored on decks and inside hangars. Aircraft required fuel. Bombs and torpedoes had to be handled. Flight decks had to remain clear for takeoff and landing. A carrier preparing aircraft for a strike was therefore operating under dangerous conditions. A successful enemy attack at the wrong moment could cause catastrophic damage. The Americans faced similar risks. The 3 American carriers also carried aircraft of different capabilities. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was the principal American carrier fighter. The Douglas TBD Devastator was an older torpedo bomber. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was the most important American dive bomber at Midway. The Dauntless was slower than some other aircraft, but it could dive steeply toward a target and release its bomb with considerable precision. Its role would become decisive. Yet before those aircraft could attack Japanese carriers, they had to find them. This was one of the great problems of the battle. The Pacific offered almost no visual landmarks. From the air, hundreds of miles of ocean could look identical. A reconnaissance aircraft could search for hours and see nothing. A carrier group could disappear into weather or darkness. A few degrees of navigational error could mean missing the enemy completely. For this reason, Midway was not simply a battle of weapons. It was a battle of search patterns. The first aircraft to locate the opposing fleet could potentially determine the next stage of the battle. On June 3, American aircraft from Midway detected Japanese ships approaching from the west. They attacked Japanese transports and other vessels, but the main carrier force remained undiscovered. The following morning, June 4, the Japanese launched their first major strike against Midway. At approximately 4:30 a.m., aircraft began taking off from Nagumo's carriers. The attack force consisted of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. As the aircraft climbed into the morning sky, the Japanese carriers continued eastward. Their immediate objective was clear: destroy Midway's air power. At first, the operation appeared to be proceeding according to plan. The Japanese strike reached the island and attacked American installations. Runways were damaged. Buildings were hit. Aircraft were destroyed or damaged. But Midway's defenses were not eliminated. The Japanese strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, reported that another attack would be necessary. That message created the decision that would shape the battle. Nagumo now faced two problems. His first strike force had not completely neutralized Midway, and reports were beginning to arrive suggesting that American ships might be somewhere in the area. The Japanese carriers had aircraft ready for further action. Some were being prepared for an attack against ships. Others were being serviced after the Midway strike. The situation changed minute by minute. Nagumo had to decide whether to continue attacking the island or prepare for a possible American naval force. The answer would require time. And time was exactly what the Japanese carrier force could no longer afford to lose. Meanwhile, American aircraft were already searching for the Japanese carriers. At Midway, Navy and Army aircraft took off. Some flew directly toward the suspected Japanese position. Others followed different search patterns. From the American carriers, aircraft also began launching. The pilots did not have a clear picture of what waited ahead. Some would never find the Japanese fleet. Others would find it and attack without fighter protection. One American torpedo squadron would eventually approach the Japanese carriers almost alone. Its aircraft would fly into one of the most dangerous attacks of the entire battle. The Japanese fighters would descend on them. The American torpedo planes would suffer devastating losses. But those attacks would force Japanese fighters to fly low and away from their carriers. And while the Japanese combat air patrol was being pulled down toward the sea, another group of American aircraft was approaching from above. The Japanese had not yet seen them. At approximately 10:22 a.m., the sky over the Japanese carrier force would change forever. The four carriers that had crossed the Pacific as instruments of Japanese expansion would suddenly become targets. And the battle for Midway would become a battle for survival. The human angle. The Battle of Midway was fought by admirals and planned by staffs, but its outcome depended on thousands of individual sailors and airmen operating inside machines that offered little protection from the violence around them. For a carrier pilot, the battlefield was difficult to understand. There was no continuous front line. No trench marked the enemy's position. A pilot could spend hours flying over empty ocean, searching for a fleet that might be only a few dozen miles away. Navigation errors were dangerous. Fuel was limited. Weather could conceal ships. A failed engine could turn a combat mission into a struggle for survival. The Japanese aviators entered the battle with an enormous reservoir of experience. Many had already fought across the Pacific and Asia. Some had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. They understood carrier operations at a level the Americans were still developing. But experience could not eliminate exhaustion. Japanese carrier crews had been fighting continuously for months. Aircraft required maintenance. Pilots required rest. Ships needed fuel and ammunition. The Japanese naval air arm was being asked to maintain an offensive tempo across an immense theater. The Americans had different problems. Many American pilots at Midway were less experienced than their Japanese counterparts. Some formations became separated. Some pilots failed to locate the enemy. Others found the Japanese fleet but attacked without adequate fighter protection. The result was brutal. American torpedo squadrons flew toward Japanese carriers at low altitude and relatively slow speed. Japanese Zero fighters attacked them before they could release their weapons effectively. Aircraft were shot down. Men disappeared into the Pacific. Yet the attacks were not meaningless. Every American formation forced the Japanese combat air patrol to react. Fighters descended toward the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers had to maneuver. Their decks remained occupied with the enormous process of preparing aircraft for another strike. And above them, American dive bombers were approaching. The men flying those dauntless dive bombers did not know that their attack would become the decisive moment of the battle. They only knew that they had found the Japanese carriers. For the sailors below, there was almost no time to react. A carrier could absorb some damage. But a bomb striking a hangar filled with fueled aircraft and aviation equipment could create a chain reaction. At Midway, that vulnerability would become painfully clear. The intelligence angle. Long before the first aircraft reached the Japanese fleet, the battle had been shaped by information. American codebreakers did not magically reveal the entire Japanese plan. They worked through fragments. Intercepted messages. Traffic patterns. Partial decryptions. Operational clues. The Japanese designation AF was one of the most important pieces. American intelligence suspected that AF represented Midway. To test that assumption, Midway transmitted a message indicating that its water purification system had failed. Japanese communications soon reported that AF was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. The conclusion was powerful. AF was almost certainly Midway. This allowed Nimitz to position his carriers where the Japanese expected to find no American force. The Americans had gained something more valuable than a weapon. They had gained time. But intelligence was never perfect. The Americans still had to estimate when the Japanese fleet would arrive. They had to determine where the carriers would be. They had to organize reconnaissance over hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean. And they had to trust that the information they possessed was accurate enough to justify risking the Pacific Fleet's remaining carriers. Nimitz made that decision. The carriers were sent forward. The Americans would not wait at Pearl Harbor for the Japanese to attack. They would lie in ambush. The Japanese, meanwhile, believed their operational security had protected the plan. That belief influenced their decisions. The Japanese commanders were not acting irrationally. They were operating according to information available to them. Their problem was that the Americans possessed information they did not know had been compromised. This created an unusual kind of battlefield advantage. The Japanese could choose their movements. But the Americans had a better idea of where those movements were likely to occur. That difference would become decisive. The technological angle. Midway was also a battle between machines. Aircraft carriers had transformed naval warfare. The decisive weapon no longer had to be a battleship's main battery. It could be an aircraft launched from a ship hundreds of miles away. The Japanese Mitsubishi Zero was highly maneuverable and possessed impressive range. It could outturn many American fighters and was extremely effective when used according to Japanese doctrine. But the Zero's performance came with compromises. It was lightly protected compared with many American aircraft. American fighters such as the Grumman F-4F Wildcat were heavier and less maneuverable, but their pilots increasingly learned to exploit tactics that avoided prolonged turning engagements. The American Douglas SBD Dauntless represented another technological advantage. Its dive-bombing capability allowed pilots to attack ships from steep angles. The aircraft could carry a significant bomb load and was equipped with a dive brake that helped control its descent during attacks. But technology alone did not determine the result. The Japanese possessed excellent aircraft. The Americans possessed excellent aircraft. What mattered was how those machines were combined with reconnaissance, communications, maintenance, training, tactics, and timing. At Midway, technology created possibilities. Human decisions determined how those possibilities were used. And on June 4, 1942, those decisions were about to collide above a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific. The tactical angle. Midway exposed the difference between possessing a powerful fleet and using that fleet under rapidly changing conditions. The Japanese carrier force had been designed for offensive operations. Its doctrine emphasized concentration, coordinated airstrikes, and decisive attacks. The carriers operated as a powerful striking group, supported by cruisers and destroyers. The Americans were also learning how to fight this new kind of naval war. Their carriers could not afford a direct exchange of aircraft with Japan indefinitely. The United States lacked the combat experience of many Japanese carrier pilots. Instead, American commanders depended heavily on reconnaissance and timing. The objective was to locate the Japanese carriers and launch attacks before the Japanese could organize a coordinated strike against the American carriers. This created a race. Every minute mattered. A carrier that discovered the enemy first could launch aircraft while the opposing fleet was still preparing its own attack. But finding the enemy was only the beginning. American aircraft approached the Japanese force in scattered groups. Torpedo bombers arrived before dive bombers. Fighters were separated from some formations. Several attacks failed to damage the Japanese carriers. From a purely tactical perspective, many of these attacks were costly. But they produced an unexpected effect. Japanese fighters were forced down toward the attacking torpedo planes. The Japanese carrier decks became increasingly crowded with aircraft and equipment. The Japanese strike groups were also being reorganized as commanders attempted to respond to reports of American ships. The Japanese tactical system was being placed under pressure. Then the American dive bombers arrived at high altitude. They attacked at nearly the same moment. The tactical advantage had shifted. The Japanese carriers were caught without an effective defensive response at the altitude from which the dauntless bombers attacked. Within minutes, 3 carriers were fatally damaged. The battle demonstrated that tactical success did not always come from destroying an enemy formation with the first attack. Sometimes the cumulative effect of repeated attacks created the conditions for a decisive strike. The leadership angle. The commanders at Midway were operating with radically different information. Admiral Chester Nimitz had the advantage of intelligence. But he could not control events after the fleet sailed. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the Carrier Task Force, while Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance commanded Task Force 16, including Enterprise and Hornet. Fletcher's Yorktown had been badly damaged at Coral Sea. Yet American shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor completed repairs in remarkably short order. The carrier reached the battle in time to participate. That decision had consequences far beyond the repair dock. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo commanded the 1st Air Fleet. He was an experienced officer facing an increasingly complicated situation. The first strike had damaged Midway but had not eliminated its ability to resist. Then reports of American ships began arriving. Nagumo had to balance competing threats. Should he prepare another attack on Midway? Should he arm aircraft for an attack against ships? Should he wait for more reconnaissance? Each choice consumed time. And every change in aircraft armament required men to move bombs and torpedoes, refuel aircraft, clear flight decks, and reorganize formations. Nagumo's decisions have been debated ever since. But the situation was not simple. He did not possess the information available to Nimitz. He did not know precisely where all American carriers were. He was receiving reports from different reconnaissance aircraft at different times. The Japanese command structure also required information to travel through established channels. That delay mattered. At sea, minutes could separate an aircraft carrier from survival. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, meanwhile, was far behind the carrier striking force with the main Japanese fleet. His battleships could provide immense firepower, but they were too distant to influence the crucial morning action. The Japanese plan had dispersed its strength across a huge area. The American carriers were concentrated closer to the expected battle zone. Leadership at Midway therefore became a contest not simply of courage or experience, but of information and time. The enemy perspective. The Japanese did not believe they were sailing toward disaster. They believed they had created a powerful operation designed to force the Americans into a decisive battle. Japan had already demonstrated what its carrier forces could accomplish. Pearl Harbor had shown the destructive potential of naval aviation. The victories of early 1942 had reinforced confidence in Japanese military power. The Japanese command therefore had reason to believe that the United States would be reluctant to risk its remaining carriers. But the American position was different. Nimitz understood that avoiding battle would not preserve the Pacific Fleet indefinitely. Japan's perimeter was expanding. Every month gave Japanese forces more time to strengthen their positions. The American carriers had to be used. Midway offered an opportunity because American intelligence had revealed the approximate location of the Japanese operation. The Japanese believed they were setting a trap for the American carriers. In reality, the Americans were waiting inside the Japanese trap. That inversion was the central strategic fact of the battle. Neither side had complete control. Neither side possessed perfect intelligence. And neither commander could see the entire battlefield. But one side knew that the enemy was coming. The other side did not know that its movements had been anticipated. That difference turned the vast Pacific into a carefully prepared ambush. By the morning of June 4, the Japanese had begun their attack against Midway. American aircraft were already searching for the Japanese carriers. And somewhere over the ocean, groups of American pilots were converging on a target they barely understood. The next phase would no longer be about preparation. It would be about impact. June 4, 1942. The morning began before sunrise. At approximately 4:30 a.m., aircraft began lifting from the decks of the Japanese carriers. The first strike force was heading toward Midway. Bombers and fighters crossed the dark Pacific in formation. Behind them, the four carriers continued steaming through the ocean, their flight decks temporarily quieter. On Midway, American aircraft were already preparing to respond. The island had been warned. The Japanese attack arrived shortly after 6:30 a.m. The first wave struck the American installations. Runways were attacked. Buildings were hit. Aircraft were destroyed. But the Japanese did not achieve everything they needed. Midway's defenses remained active. The Japanese commander of the strike force, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, reported that another attack would be required. That message reached Nagumo's flagship, Akagi. Now the Japanese commander faced a problem. Aircraft returning from Midway needed to land. Other aircraft were being prepared for possible attacks against American ships. The situation became increasingly complicated. Then came another report. American ships had been sighted. At first, the information was incomplete. The Japanese did not immediately know how large the American force was. Nagumo had to decide what to do with the aircraft being prepared on his carriers. The decision was delayed while reconnaissance information developed. Meanwhile, the Americans were searching. From Midway, PBY Catalina patrol aircraft were scanning the ocean. One of them eventually spotted Japanese ships. The information began moving toward American commanders. The Japanese carrier force had been found. But finding the carriers was another matter. The first American attacks were launched from Midway. Bombers and torpedo aircraft flew toward the Japanese fleet. Their aircraft were older. Their formations were often scattered. Their pilots had little fighter protection. They were heading into a highly experienced Japanese combat air patrol. The Japanese Zeros attacked. One American formation after another came under fire. The torpedo bombers were particularly vulnerable. Their aircraft had to fly low and slowly to launch their weapons. That made them easy targets for fighters above. American losses became severe. Some aircraft were destroyed before reaching the Japanese carriers. Others managed to release torpedoes, but the attacks failed to achieve a decisive hit. From the perspective of the Japanese fleet, the immediate danger appeared to be weakening. But the attacks had forced the Japanese fighters downward. Their attention was focused on aircraft attacking from low altitude.
The Japanese carriers were still trying to organize their own strike.
Then the situation changed again.
American carrier aircraft had been launched.
But the three American carriers had not sent one perfectly coordinated formation. Different squadrons departed at different times. Some pilots became separated.
Some searched in the wrong direction.
Several aircraft ran dangerously low on fuel.
From the American carriers, the pilots had only approximate information about the enemy's location.
One group eventually found the Japanese fleet. The aircraft approached from low altitude.
It was Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet.
The Douglas TBD Devastators flew toward the Japanese carriers.
They were slow. They had no modern self-sealing fuel tanks. They carried torpedoes that were difficult to employ effectively at high speed.
Japanese fighters descended upon them. The squadron was devastated.
Only one pilot from Torpedo Squadron 8 survived the attack. Ensign George Gay was left floating in the ocean as Japanese aircraft continued operating overhead.
The attack itself failed to sink a carrier.
But it changed the tactical situation.
Japanese fighters had been pulled down toward the torpedo bombers. Then another American torpedo squadron attacked. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived. Again, Japanese fighters intercepted.
The Americans suffered heavy losses.
Again, no carrier was immediately destroyed. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked. Its aircraft also faced Japanese fighters.
The losses were severe. To observers on the Japanese carriers, the attacks seemed to be failing. But the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn away from the altitude at which the decisive attack was approaching.
Above the fleet, American dive bombers were searching for the carriers. Among them were aircraft from Enterprise led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey. McCluskey's group had initially struggled to locate the Japanese fleet.
Fuel was becoming a serious concern.
Then, after seeing the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arisher, McCluskey followed its course.
The destroyer was racing back toward the Japanese carriers after having dropped behind the formation during an anti-submarine maneuver.
The wake became a clue. McCluskey and his pilots followed. Below them was the Japanese carrier force. It was approximately 10:20 in the morning. The Japanese carriers were vulnerable.
Their flight decks were crowded.
Aircraft were being prepared. Fuel lines and equipment were present around the hangar areas.
The Japanese had expected to launch another strike. Instead, they were about to receive one.
American Dauntless dive bombers appeared overhead. The Japanese fighters were too low.
The first bombs fell.
The effect was immediate. USS Enterprise's dive bombers attacked Kaga and Akagi. Aircraft from Yorktown attacked Soryu. Bombs struck the carriers. Fires spread through hangars and flight decks. Aircraft exploded. Aviation fuel ignited. Weapons and equipment were destroyed. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers had been mortally damaged.
The transformation was almost impossible to comprehend. Only moments earlier, the Japanese carrier force had been preparing to launch its own strike. Now Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning. But one carrier remained.
Hiryu. And its aircraft were still capable of fighting. The Japanese battle had changed from an offensive operation into a desperate attempt to survive. But the American victory was not yet complete. Hiryu would strike back. The counterattack. The Japanese carrier force was no longer intact.
By late morning on June 4, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning.
But the Japanese still had one operational carrier. Hiryu.
Its aircraft had not been caught in the same devastating attack.
Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commander of the 2nd Carrier Division, understood that the battle was not finished. Hiryu launched aircraft against the American carriers. The first Japanese strike found Yorktown.
American fighters attempted to intercept the attackers, but Japanese dive bombers and torpedo aircraft reached the carrier.
Bombs struck Yorktown.
the carrier suffered serious damage. Its flight deck was damaged, fires broke out, and the ship temporarily lost propulsion. For a short time, it appeared that Yorktown might be finished.
But American damage control teams began working immediately. They fought fires. They repaired electrical systems. They restored propulsion. The carrier began operating again. The Japanese had not destroyed the American carrier force. They had damaged one carrier. The distinction mattered.
Meanwhile, the American commanders were trying to determine exactly what had happened. They knew several Japanese carriers had been hit. But they did not yet know the full scale of the Japanese losses. The Japanese still had aircraft. The American carriers were still vulnerable. A second strike from Hiryu was launched later that afternoon. This attack again found Yorktown. Japanese aircraft attacked the damaged carrier and inflicted further damage. Torpedoes struck. Yorktown was again badly damaged. The carrier lost power and began listing. For the Japanese pilots returning from the attack, the scene appeared to indicate a successful strike. They reported that an American carrier had been destroyed. But Yorktown was still afloat. The American ship's crew continued fighting. Eventually, however, the carrier's condition became critical. The crew was ordered to abandon ship. Yorktown would remain a target even after the main carrier battle had shifted elsewhere. The American command now had another objective: find Hiryu. The Japanese carrier was believed to be somewhere west of the main battle area. American reconnaissance aircraft searched for it. The surviving Japanese carrier was already preparing for another engagement. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Its air group had suffered losses. Its position had been exposed. And American dive bombers were closing in. Late on June 4, American aircraft found Hiryu. The dauntless dive bombers attacked. Bombs struck the carrier. Fires spread across the ship. The 4th Japanese fleet carrier was now burning. There was no longer a Japanese carrier force capable of continuing the planned operation. Hiryu remained afloat for several hours. Eventually, the ship was abandoned. On June 5, Japanese destroyers scuttled her. The 4 carriers that had formed the core of Nagumo's striking force were gone. But the battle itself was not yet completely over. Japanese forces continued operating around Midway. The main Japanese fleet remained in the area. American forces also had to deal with their own losses. The carrier Yorktown, heavily damaged during the battle, was being towed. On June 6, Japanese submarine I-168 penetrated the American screen. The submarine fired torpedoes. One struck Yorktown. Another struck the destroyer USS Hammond, which had been assisting the damaged carrier. Hammond sank rapidly. Yorktown finally capsized and sank on June 7. The loss was painful. But strategically, the battle had already been decided. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. The United States had lost 1 carrier. The difference was not merely a matter of ships. The Japanese carriers carried highly trained aircrews whose experience was difficult to replace. Japan could build new aircraft. It could eventually build new carriers. But replacing experienced naval aviators was far more difficult. Many Japanese pilots who had survived the early months of the war were now dead. The American carrier fleet had also suffered casualties. But the industrial base behind it was expanding. American shipyards were producing carriers, aircraft, engines, and replacement equipment at a scale Japan could not match. Midway therefore destroyed something larger than 4 ships. It destroyed the strategic momentum Japan had built since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had entered the battle intending to seize an island and eliminate American carrier power. Instead, they lost the carriers that had carried out Japan's greatest naval victories. The result was not an immediate end to Japanese offensive operations. Japan still possessed a powerful navy. Its army remained large. Its empire still stretched across enormous areas of Asia and the Pacific. But the balance had shifted. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan had suffered a major carrier defeat in which its losses were strategically catastrophic. The Americans had survived Pearl Harbor. They had survived the early Japanese offensives. Now they had destroyed the centerpiece of a Japanese operation. The Battle of Midway had become a turning point. Not because Japan suddenly became weak, but because Japan's margin for offensive action had narrowed dramatically. The Japanese fleet would continue fighting, but it would increasingly fight a war in which the initiative was slipping away. The Pacific was still enormous. The war would continue for more than 3 years. But after June 1942, Japan could no longer assume that its carrier forces would dominate the ocean. The next phase would be fought not only with carriers and aircraft, but with industrial production, replacement crews, logistics, and attrition. And those were areas in which the United States possessed an advantage that would become increasingly difficult for Japan to overcome. The cost of Midway. When the fighting around Midway finally subsided, the scale of the Japanese defeat became clearer. 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been lost: Akoji, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. These were not ordinary warships. They were among the most valuable operational assets in the Japanese Navy. They represented years of construction, training, doctrine, and combat experience. Their destruction removed a major portion of Japan's first-line carrier strength in a matter of hours. The United States had lost USS Yorktown. The destroyer Hammond was also sunk. American aircraft losses were heavy. But the strategic balance of the battle was unmistakable. Japan had entered the operation expecting to seize Midway and draw the American carriers into a battle on Japanese terms. Instead, Japan had lost its 4 principal carriers while failing to capture the atoll. The island remained American. The American carriers had survived the main battle. The Japanese fleet withdrew. For the United States, the result was a major psychological victory. Only 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor had created the impression that the Japanese Navy possessed overwhelming superiority. That impression was now broken. But Midway did not destroy Japanese naval power overnight. Japan still possessed carriers. It still possessed battleships, cruisers, submarines, destroyers, aircraft, and enormous numbers of soldiers. Its empire remained extensive. The Japanese military could still launch offensive operations. The real damage was deeper. Japan had lost experienced carrier aviators and support personnel who could not easily be replaced. Carrier warfare depended on more than the hull of a ship. A carrier required pilots. It required aircraft mechanics. It required deck crews. It required navigators, signalmen, ordnance specialists, engineers, and officers. Every aircraft lost represented trained personnel. Every experienced pilot killed reduced the quality of the next air group. Japan's naval aviation system had been built around a relatively small pool of highly trained specialists. The early victories of the war had depended heavily on those men. At Midway, many were lost. The United States also suffered the deaths of experienced airmen. But the American system had a different foundation. The United States could expand training programs and produce aircraft on an enormous scale. New pilots could be trained. New carriers could be constructed. New aircraft could be manufactured. The industrial imbalance between the two nations would become increasingly important as the war continued. The immediate Japanese reaction was also significant. The defeat was not publicly presented as the disaster it had been. The Japanese government controlled information and did not reveal the full extent of the carrier losses to the population. This meant that the strategic consequences were understood primarily inside the military leadership. The Japanese Navy now had to confront a difficult reality. Its planned operation had failed. The American fleet had not been destroyed. Midway had not been captured. And 4 fleet carriers had disappeared beneath the Pacific. The Japanese main body had remained too far away to influence the decisive morning battle. This exposed one of the fundamental weaknesses in the operation. Japan had concentrated enormous resources into a plan that depended on the American fleet responding exactly as expected. But the Americans did not behave according to Japanese assumptions. They were already waiting. The loss of experienced aircrews. The destruction of the carriers was only one part of the Japanese losses. The men who went down with them mattered enormously. Carrier aviation required years of training. A skilled pilot was not produced simply by placing him inside an aircraft. He had to learn navigation. He had to learn formation flying. He had to understand carrier landings. He had to recognize enemy aircraft. He had to operate weapons. And he had to perform all of this while moving at high speed under combat conditions. Japan had invested heavily in producing elite naval aviators. The system emphasized quality. That approach had produced highly capable pilots during the opening months of the war. But quality could become a weakness when casualties increased. The United States was developing a system capable of producing large numbers of trained pilots and aircrews. Japan struggled to expand its training system at the same pace while maintaining the same level of experience. Midway accelerated that problem. The Japanese could replace ships eventually. Replacing veteran aircrews was much harder. The effect would become increasingly visible in later battles. At Guadalcanal, in the Solomons, Japanese and American air forces would fight over Henderson Field and the surrounding seas. Experienced Japanese aviators would continue to disappear. New pilots would enter combat with less preparation. The difference would grow. Midway therefore affected the Pacific War not only through the carriers destroyed in June 1942, but through the human expertise lost aboard them. A strategic shift. Before Midway, Japan had largely dictated the direction of the Pacific War. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had expanded rapidly. They had captured territory. They had destroyed Allied ships. They had established bases across the region. Midway did not immediately reverse all of those gains. But it changed the strategic initiative. The United States could now begin choosing where to apply pressure. The first major American offensive in the Pacific would come soon. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal and nearby islands in the Solomon Islands. The campaign would become a brutal struggle involving land forces, aircraft, submarines, and surface ships. It would also demonstrate that the war after Midway would not be decided by one dramatic fleet engagement. The Pacific War would become a war of attrition. Every island required supplies. Every airfield required fuel and aircraft. Every damaged ship required repair. Every lost pilot required replacement. Every mile of advance required enormous logistical effort. Japan had lost the ability to win quickly. The United States was beginning to mobilize its full industrial strength. The battle at Midway had not ended the Pacific War. It had changed the conditions under which that war would continue. And the consequences would reach far beyond the four carriers lying beneath the Pacific. The war after Midway. The Japanese withdrawal from Midway marked the end of the operation, but not the end of Japanese ambition. Japan still held an enormous empire. Its forces occupied territory from Southeast Asia deep into the Pacific. Its navy remained dangerous. Its army remained capable of launching major operations. But the strategic environment had changed. The Japanese plan for Midway had been designed around a decisive carrier battle. The destruction of four carriers meant that Japan had lost much of the carrier strength it had used to dominate the opening months of the war. The loss was particularly serious because of what those ships represented. Akagi had been the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack. Kaga had also participated in that operation. Soryo and Hiria had fought through the early campaigns of the war. Together, the four carriers represented the experienced core of Japan's first air fleet. Their destruction removed not only ships but aircraft, maintenance facilities, command personnel, and highly trained crews. The Japanese Navy could not simply replace them with new carriers overnight. Even more difficult was replacing the men who had operated them. The United States faced the same basic problem of wartime losses, but it possessed an industrial and training system that could expand enormously.
American shipyards were producing new carriers.
Aircraft factories were producing thousands of aircraft.
Training programs were expanding. The United States could absorb losses and continue building.
Japan had to conserve resources.
The difference would become increasingly important. Guadalcanal.
Only 2 months after Midway, American forces launched an offensive in the Solomon Islands.
On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands. Their objective included an unfinished Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal.
The Americans completed the airfield and named it Henderson Field. The Japanese immediately attempted to retake it.
What followed was a campaign of extraordinary violence. Japanese and American aircraft fought over the island. Warships moved through the narrow waters around Guadalcanal at night.
Cruisers and destroyers bombarded positions on shore. Transport ships attempted to bring reinforcements through dangerous waters. The campaign became a prolonged test of logistics and endurance. This was the kind of war Midway had helped create. Instead of one decisive battle ending the conflict, the Pacific became a series of connected struggles. Aircraft carriers remained critically important.
But airfields became equally valuable. An island with an operational airfield could influence hundreds of miles of ocean. Control of those airfields determined where ships could safely operate and where aircraft could search.
The strategic contest was becoming increasingly industrial.
Who could replace aircraft faster? Who could repair ships? Who could supply distant bases? Who could train new pilots? Who could maintain an uninterrupted flow of fuel and ammunition across thousands of miles?
The answers increasingly favored the United States.
The Japanese reassessment. The full consequences of Midway were not immediately accepted by everyone in Japan. The Japanese military had entered the Pacific War with enormous confidence.
The victories of 1941 and early 1942 had reinforced the belief that Japan could defeat or intimidate its opponents before American industrial strength became overwhelming.
Midway challenged that assumption. The Japanese Navy had failed to destroy the American carriers. Instead, it had lost 4 of its own. The battle also demonstrated the danger of excessive operational complexity. The Japanese force had been divided into multiple groups. The Aleutian operation occurred at the same time. The invasion force was separate from the carrier striking force. The main body under Yamamoto was too far away to intervene quickly.
This dispersion made the operation difficult to coordinate.
The Japanese commanders were also working with incomplete information.
They did not know that American intelligence had penetrated their communications sufficiently to identify Midway as the target.
That was perhaps the most important hidden factor of the entire battle.
The Americans had not simply guessed. They had prepared. What Midway really changed?
It is tempting to describe Midway as the moment Japan lost the Pacific War. That is too simple. Japan did not surrender after Midway.
Its army remained powerful.
Its navy continued fighting. Japanese forces continued offensive operations. The war would last more than 3 years after June 1942. But Midway changed the direction of the conflict. Before the battle, Japan was expanding. After the battle, Japan increasingly had to defend and reinforce its existing positions while attempting to regain the initiative. The United States, meanwhile, was beginning to build the military machine that would eventually overwhelm the Japanese Empire. Midway therefore represented a strategic turning point rather than an instant collapse. The battle demonstrated that Japan could be defeated at sea. It showed that American intelligence could penetrate Japanese plans.
It showed the importance of reconnaissance and carrier aviation. And it demonstrated the extraordinary consequences of timing. At approximately 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 3 Japanese carriers were struck within minutes. That short period altered the course of the Pacific War. The battle had lasted only 4 days. But its consequences stretched across the remaining years of the conflict.
The Japanese Navy would continue to fight with determination. American forces would continue to suffer enormous casualties. There would be more carrier battles, more islands, more aircraft, more ships lost beneath the Pacific. But the strategic momentum had changed. The Japanese advance had reached its limit. The next phase of the war would be a long struggle to determine how far the United States could push across the Pacific and how much Japan could still defend. The answer would eventually be decided not by one battle, but by a combination of industrial power, logistics, intelligence, technology, and human endurance. Midway had revealed the direction. The years ahead would reveal the cost. The Pacific Ocean does not preserve battlefields. There are no trenches left at Midway. No ruined cities mark the place where the decisive attacks took place. Only water remains. But beneath that water are the ships that once carried Japan's confidence across the Pacific. Akoji, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Their loss did not end the war. It did not make Japan powerless. And it did not guarantee an American victory. What Midway changed was the direction of the struggle. Japan had entered the battle believing it could use surprise and concentrated naval power to destroy the remaining American carriers and seize a strategically important island. Instead, American intelligence had turned the Japanese operation against itself. The battle demonstrated that modern warfare could be decided before opposing forces ever came within sight of one another. A decrypted message. A reconnaissance aircraft. A navigational decision. A few minutes of timing. And thousands of miles of ocean suddenly became the setting for a turning point in history. The men who fought at Midway could not know what their actions would mean decades later. American pilots could not see the future when they climbed toward the Japanese carriers. Japanese sailors could not know that the ships beneath their feet would soon be lost. They were simply fighting the battle in front of them. But history is often changed that way. Not by a single weapon. Not by one commander alone. But by thousands of decisions made under pressure, with incomplete information, in places where the consequences cannot yet be seen. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese carrier force had come to Midway expecting to deliver another victory. Instead, it encountered an enemy that knew it was coming. And in the span of a few minutes, the balance of the Pacific shifted. The war would continue. The losses would become far greater. But after Midway, Japan was no longer advancing with the same certainty. The Pacific had become a different battlefield. And the battle for its future had only begun.